One of the most difficult problems for humanity to deal with is the fact that there's a significant amount of evil and suffering in the world. Our history is filled with the consequences of moral horrors and treacherous natural disasters, things like Nazi Germany and terrorist attacks, and the destruction resulting from things like earthquakes and tsunamis that shake us to the very core of our being. I think we all would say that if we were in a position to be able to prevent those things, we would. But that leads those of us who believe in God to a pretty significant question. If God is all-loving, like Christians say, and He also has the ability to prevent evil because He is all-powerful, then why doesn't He? This question is what many theologians and philosophers have dubbed the problem of evil, and it's been an issue wrestled with for thousands of years. Many atheists insist that the coexistence of an all-powerful and all-loving God with all of the evil and suffering that we see in the world is just impossible or very unlikely. Some say that the idea of God not preventing evil is like the idea of a married bachelor or a square circle. It's just a contradiction and so can't be real. Their argument would sound something like this. Either God has to exist without evil, or evil has to exist without God. Since we know that evil exists in the world, then it follows that God cannot be real. And this actually brings us to an important realization. The so-called problem of evil can be looked at from two different perspectives, an intellectual one and an emotional one. Now, from the intellectual perspective, it seems there are actually two issues hidden under the surface that need to be addressed by anyone who wants to maintain both God and evil exist. And the first is the idea that if God is all-loving, then He would prevent evil and suffering. And the second is that if God is all-powerful, then He would be able to prevent evil and suffering. Let's think about that first issue for a minute. Is it really true that if God is all-loving, then He would prevent evil and suffering in the world? That doesn't really seem all that obvious. Maybe it's possible that God has good reasons for allowing the evil and suffering to take place. Most of us could probably think of examples where we allow suffering in our own lives for some overriding purpose. Maybe God has that same kind of justified reason for allowing the evil and suffering in the world. And if that's even possible, then God is not like the married bachelor or the square circle that we referred to earlier. If He really does have a sufficient reason for allowing evil in the world, then there's just no contradiction. But what about that second claim that because God is all-powerful, then He would be able to prevent evil and suffering? Well, like we just said, maybe God is able to prevent certain evils and suffering, but He has a good reason for allowing them. But at an even deeper level, just because God is all-powerful, it doesn't necessarily mean that He can create just any old reality. If God wants to create a world of creatures who really do have free will, then a world without evil just might not be an option for Him. Maybe in every world that God creates creatures with free will, at least some of them go wrong. He couldn't force them not to, because then they wouldn't be free creatures, which is what He wanted in the first place. Forcing someone to freely do something is like our married bachelor or our square circle. That is a contradiction, and so it cannot be real. And so it may be the case that even though God prefers His creatures not to do evil things, they do them anyway. And so it's just not necessarily true that if God wants to create a world of creatures like us who have free will, that He would prefer or even could prevent evil and suffering. All right, so maybe the existence of God and the existence of evil are compatible with each other, but someone still might say that evil makes it very unlikely that God is real. Maybe the amount of evil and suffering in the world makes it unlikely that God really does have reasons for it. And if He does have reasons for it, how come He doesn't tell us what they are? A couple of things. First, we're in no position to figure out whether or not God really does have reasons for allowing evil and suffering in the world. We're so limited in our perspective and in time and space, it would be impossible for us to make that kind of judgment. Maybe God's reasons are so complex and so far-reaching that we wouldn't even understand them. Maybe they span throughout history over hundreds or even thousands of years. We just can't say with any certainty that God probably doesn't have a reason for allowing this evil. Okay, but why doesn't God tell us His reasons? Well, we don't really know why. Maybe He does sometimes. Maybe He can't tell us His reasons, because if He did, then we might act in such a way as to actually hinder His reasons. Maybe we wouldn't even understand them if he told them to us. So we just don't really have any justification to think that if God really does have these reasons, then we would be the first ones to know about them. But secondly, we shouldn't only be looking at the problem of evil when trying to determine the likelihood of God's existence, but instead we need to look at all the evidence. Think of a court case where evidence is being presented against the suspect of some crime. You wouldn't just look at some isolated piece of evidence. You need the full scope. Maybe evil and suffering could give us a little room for doubt on its own. But what about in the context of other evidence for God's existence, or even of our direct experience of Him? Relative to all of that information, maybe it's very likely that God is real. Even more, if Christianity is true, then God's priorities are not human comfort and happiness in this life. His desire is that you know Him and that you love Him, which is an infinite good that far outweighs any suffering that's used to get us there. So, as deep of a discussion that we can have about the intellectual problem of evil, when it boils down to it, I think it's the emotional force of evil and suffering that we struggle with most. We can understand all the right things, yet struggle to not get angry with God or to doubt His goodness. But if Christianity is true, then we can take comfort in knowing that God has not abandoned us in our suffering. He Himself has come to earth to suffer alongside us and to redeem us from the evil that surrounds us. This seems to be the greatest of all goods, that an infinitely perfect Creator would condescend so much for the sake of His creatures. So, maybe evil and suffering is confusing, difficult, and frustrating for us, but ultimately, the solution can only rest in the hands of the God that it seemingly calls into question.